Imagine approaching a military checkpoint in eastern Ukraine in 2024. The soldiers don't ask for your passport first. They ask you to say one word, palianytsia. It's a type of Ukrainian bread. Simple, right? But if you're a Russian speaker trying to infiltrate Ukrainian lines, your tongue will betray you. The subtle palatalization, the way the syllables flow, it's a linguistic tripwire. This isn't just language anymore. This is survival. Vladimir Putin has explicitly weaponized language as his justification for invasion. He claims he's protecting Russian speakers, turning every person who speaks Russian in Ukraine into an involuntary political pawn. Meanwhile, for Kyiv, the Ukrainian language has become a security border as real as any trench line. In this war, a preposition can signal your allegiance. Legislation becomes ammunition, and millions are voluntarily abandoning their mother tongue to sever ties with the aggressor. In this video, we'll explore how language became a battlefield in Ukraine. To understand how a word became a weapon, we have to go back more than 150 years. To understand linguistic checkpoints, we must travel back to 1863. Interior Minister Pyotr Valuev of the Russian Empire issued a secret decree that would echo through generations. He banned educational and religious texts in Ukrainian, declaring, "No separate Little Russian language ever existed, does not exist, and shall never exist." Note the term Little Russian. Even the name denies Ukrainian its independence. This wasn't cultural policy. This was systematic linguistic eradication. The Tsarist regime understood something fundamental. Language shapes consciousness. Control how people speak, and you control how they think. You control whether they can imagine themselves as a separate nation. 13 years later, in 1876, Tsar Alexander II escalated the assault. Signing the M's ukaz while vacationing in Germany, he banned not just books, but theater performances, song lyrics, anything in Ukrainian. The empire was terrified of a language it couldn't control. Now, fast forward to the 1930s under Stalin. A generation of Ukrainian writers, playwrights, and scientists was systematically purged in what's now called the executed Renaissance. At Sandarmach in 1937, hundreds were shot and dumped into mass graves. This was decapitation by bullet. Kill the poets, and who writes the resistance? Execute the linguists, and who defends the grammar? The Soviet strategy was clear. Destroy the people who give the language prestige, and the language itself withers. That same argument returns in July 2021. Vladimir Putin publishes an essay titled "On the Historical Unity of Russians and Ukrainians." His thesis: Russians and Ukrainians are one people. Ukrainian national identity is artificial, an anti-Russia construct engineered by foreign enemies. This isn't nostalgia. This is strategy. Putin's concept of the Russian world, Ruski Mir, defines Russian borders not by territory, but by language. Wherever the Russian language exists, Moscow claims the right to intervene militarily. This weaponizes language itself. Every Russian speaker becomes a potential pretext for invasion. The current war is the direct continuation of Valuev's circular, now enforced with artillery instead of decrees. Before we get to tanks and laws, we need to talk about a single preposition. In Russian, you use v, meaning in, for sovereign states. В Германии, in Germany, в Польше, in Poland. But for Ukraine, Russian speakers traditionally said на Украине, using na, which means on. Grammatically, na is used for islands or undefined regions. На Кубе, on Cuba. Applying it to a sovereign country implies it's not really a country at all, but a borderland. In 1993, newly independent Ukraine officially requested Russia switch to в Украине to acknowledge its sovereignty. Although the request dates to the early 1990s, the refusal hardened under Putin when grammar itself became ideology. Today, it's a deliberate political marker, a shibboleth, a word used to instantly reveal who belongs and who doesn't. Kremlin officials exclusively use na to signal Ukraine lacks legitimacy. Anti-war Russians and Ukrainians speaking Russian exclusively use v. This forces every Russian speaker to make a political declaration in every sentence about the country. In 2012, Ukraine's pro-Russian President Yanukovych passed the Kivalov-Kolesnichenko law, allowing Russian to become an official regional language wherever native speakers exceeded 10%. Ukrainian nationalists saw this as creeping Russification. Then came the Maidan Revolution of 2014. Yanukovych fled. In February 2014, the Ukrainian parliament voted to repeal that language law. Although the acting president vetoed the repeal, meaning the law technically stayed in force, the damage was done. Russian propaganda seized on that vote as proof of an imminent genocide of Russian speakers. Within weeks, Russia annexed Crimea. The message from Moscow was clear. A parliamentary vote about language policy was justification for military invasion. Ukraine's 2019 language law marked a turning point in defensive nationalism. It mandated Ukrainian in the public sector, education, and the service industry. Waiters must greet customers in Ukrainian, only switching to Russian if requested. TV and radio stations must broadcast 90% of content in Ukrainian. For Kyiv, this isn't cultural chauvinism, it's security policy. If the population speaks Russian, they consume Russian media and propaganda. If they speak Ukrainian, they're insulated from the Kremlin's narrative sphere. As one Ukrainian official put it, where the Ukrainian language ends, Russia begins. The Venice Commission, the Council of Europe's advisory body, criticized the law as disproportionate. But Ukraine argues this is about survival. Language borders are the first line of defense. On February 21, 2022, 3 days before the full-scale invasion, Vladimir Putin delivered a speech that weaponized the word genocide. He explicitly linked Ukraine's 2019 language law to genocide against Russian speakers. Language quotas, regulations about TV content percentages, were equated with physical extermination. Here's the key idea. Putin diluted one of history's most serious terms to justify a full-scale war. The bitter irony? The cities he claimed to be liberating, Mariupol, Kharkiv, Bakhmut, were predominantly Russian-speaking. By bombing them into rubble, Putin has done more to eradicate the Russian language in Ukraine than any Ukrainian law ever could. The weapon he claimed to defend became the victim of his own artillery. Something remarkable happened after February 24, 2022. Before the invasion, approximately 50% of Ukrainians spoke Ukrainian at home. Russian-dominated cities like Odessa and Kharkiv. But by 2024, polling by Ukraine's two leading research organizations, Rating Group and the Kyiv International Institute of Sociology, shows public sphere usage of Ukrainian has surged to 80%. Exclusive home usage has risen to 65 to 75%. This shift wasn't enforced by language police. This was a voluntary psychological break. Millions of bilingual Ukrainians woke up one morning and found they could not speak Russian anymore. The language of Pushkin had become the language of missile strikes. In Odessa, historically, one of the most Russian-speaking cities in Ukraine, cafes that once served you in Russian now respond in Ukrainian. Not because of fines, but because of identity. Language has become a badge of loyalty. This is where Putin's narrative collapses. Many soldiers in the armed forces of Ukraine, particularly in elite units like Azov or the 3rd Assault Brigade, speak Russian among themselves. Or they speak Surzik, a chaotic hybrid of Ukrainian grammar and Russian vocabulary. These Russian-speaking soldiers are killing Russian invaders. They're defending Ukraine in the language Putin claims gives him the right to invade. The reality of the trenches is pragmatically bilingual. They fight for Ukraine in Russian, and when they need to identify infiltrators, they use Ukrainian code words like palianytsia, words the untrained Russian tongue struggles with. Language becomes tactical. The shibboleth is Ukrainian, but the conversation between soldiers is often Russian. This paradox obliterates Moscow's claim that it's liberating Russian speakers. To understand how people actually switch languages, we need to talk about something messy. For decades, Surzik was ridiculed as the tongue of uneducated peasants, a linguistic bastard that belonged nowhere. It's a chaotic mix of Ukrainian grammar with Russian vocabulary, or vice versa, with no consistent rules. But anthropologists and linguists are now observing something fascinating. Surzik is becoming a transitional vehicle for de-Russification. It's no longer a mark of shame, it's a mark of effort. Russian speakers trying to switch to Ukrainian often stumble through Surzik on their journey. Grammatical mistakes signal political loyalty. They say, "I'm trying, I'm moving toward Ukrainian, even if I'm not there yet." In a country at war, effort counts as much as fluency. Surzik has evolved from a dialect of shame into a dialect of resistance. The trajectory is now undeniable. The Russian language in Ukraine is dying, not by legislative decree, but by missiles and bombs. It's shifting from a lingua franca of business and culture to what linguists call a kitchen language, spoken by the older generation in private homes, destined to fade as the youth associate it exclusively with occupation. This matters because it mirrors the linguistic battles of Ireland or Catalonia, but with kinetic stakes. Just as Irish Gaelic became a symbol of resistance against British rule, Ukrainian has become the ultimate marker of citizenship and survival. The tragic irony is complete. The war Putin launched to save the Russian language has ensured its terminal decline in Ukraine. Every bomb that falls on a Russian-speaking neighborhood is another nail in the coffin of Russian as a living language of Ukrainian society. Ukraine's linguistic battlefield offers a lesson that echoes far beyond its borders. Language is never just communication. It's identity, security, memory, and power all compressed into syntax and phonetics. When empires collapse, when nations fight for survival, language becomes the first weapon and the last refuge. What makes Ukraine's case unique is the velocity and the stakes. This isn't a slow cultural shift over generations. This is millions of people changing how they speak in real time, under artillery fire. The Russian language isn't being legislated out of existence. It's being bombed out of existence by the very power that claimed to protect it. So the next time you hear someone say this war is about NATO expansion or natural resources, remember the checkpoint. Remember palianytsia. Remember that a preposition, na versus ve, can determine whether a nation exists in the grammar of its neighbor. Language is the battlefield where identity is won or lost. If you found this deep dive valuable, subscribe for more geopolitical analysis that goes beyond the headlines. And let me know in the comments, do you think language laws are justified as security policy, or do they cross a line? What other hidden dimensions of this conflict should we explore? Thanks for watching.